Are you discouraged by sin's destruction in your life? I'm wondering, Christian, if you're ever tempted to despair that God might cast you away because of the remaining sin you see in your life. We've come now in our devotionals to 1st and 2nd Kings, a story which could be discouraging because it tells about Israel's glorious apex, slow death, and final exile from God's presence. You'll remember that back in Genesis, God promised a seed that would defeat the serpent and bring God's people back to Eden. And as David's reign gives way to the peacetime reign of Solomon, it seems like that return to Eden might be right around the corner. Solomon brings great peace, and through the temple, God dwells in his people's midst again. But like Adam in the garden, the nation of Israel fails to obey the voice of the Lord. Instead, they listen to the voice of the serpent, the idolatrous nations around them. And so they surely die a slow death by idolatry that plays out across the reigns in 1st and 2nd Kings. Now the Lord is patient with them. He sends prophets like Elijah and Elisha to call them back. And there are moments of reformation where the decay is slowed. But Kings ultimately ends with God's wrath fully poured out on the nation. They're exiled, cut off from God's presence in the temple, and cast out of the promised land. Listen to this summary from 2 Kings 17. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. And the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel, and afflicted them, and gave them into the hand of plunderers, until he had cast them out of his sight. So, is Kings ultimately a book of despair? No, it's not. We know it's not, because in Matthew's gospel, he begins with Jesus' genealogy, listing a lot of the lousy kings we find in this book to show us that Jesus is the fulfillment of the book of Kings. He's the righteous king who wins peace and paradise for his people by suffering death and exile on their behalf. As we see Israel suffering and dying under the weight of their sin, we're pointed ahead to the true Israel who walked the road to exile. He went to the garden. He took the cup of God's wrath, drained it to the dregs, and was cast out from God's presence on the cross. He was cast away for his people so they would never have to die eternally. And so, brother and sister in Christ, as you today confess the ravages of your sin, remember that the wages for every unkind word, every lustful thought, every impure motive is indeed death. And Jesus bore those wages for you. So now God will never cast you off. Your portion isn't exile. Your portion is fellowship with God now and forever. Have a good day.